Thank you to Factor for sponsoring this episode. I'll say it. Okay, yeah, I can cook. Yeah, I can meal prep. Do I have the time? No. I gotta wake up already at 5 a.m. before I head on over to the job site and work my 9 to 5. And then when I come home, I play Command and Conquer for 7 hours. You expect me to meal prep in that time? How is that even possible? Well, luckily for us, there's Factor. Factor is a meal delivery service that ships dietitian-approved, chef-prepared meals right to your doorstep. And guess what? Factor is doubling. Their weekly menus now include 80-plus rotating meals. So now you can accomplish your wellness goals while also never getting bored of these amazing meals. And on top of that, my heart is gonna explode out of my chest. And on top of that, they're expanding their global flavor options to now include Mediterranean and Asian. Head on over to Factor75.com or click the link in the description down below and use code ZachTheBoldFB50 for 50% off your first box as well as free breakfast for 1 year. You heard that right. Head on over to Factor75.com or click the link in the description below. Use code ZachTheBoldFB50 for 50% off your first box as well as free breakfast for 1 whole year. And as always, thank you, Factor, for sponsoring this episode. Huzzah! Prepping for Dungeons & Dragons is weird, right? Like, if you want to get better at Magic the Gathering, you play more Magic the Gathering. If you want to become a better writer, you learn more about story structure and you look up more intricate words, I guess. And if you want to be into sports, you practice and you exercise and you get better. With Dungeons & Dragons, you can't really do that. I mean, you can play Baldur's Gate, I guess, but that's not the same thing. And you don't really want to be the DM and then narrate something and kind of just like go around the table as each player. I mean, I guess that would work, but no one does that. But if we do want to become a better DM in our downtime, we should look at what D&D is comprised of, which is storytelling and game design. You want to be able to tell a good enough story to keep your players captivated while also designing combat that challenges them, which allows your players to feel like heroes without them becoming unkillable gods. However, we as DMs don't have time to become an author or a game designer. We have time to run a campaign with rules someone else wrote, and when we find ourselves stuck, we don't always go to Brandon Sanderson for writing advice or Hideo Kojima for game design advice. We go to the other D&D player and we go, how do I make my game better? Which in my opinion doesn't really help because it doesn't look at the root of the issue, which is hypocritical because I'm a D&D YouTuber giving D&D advice. But people still want to know what I think, and I find it my responsibility to look a little deeper into the issue. And a lot of the questions I get are hyper-specific. They ask me about a combat that they ran, or their team composition, or some narrative element. And then I always get the question, how do I make combat good? And I have no idea what to say. Because they're not asking me what they can do to balance their combat or what monsters they can add to make their combat more interesting. They're simply asking, what makes a good combat? What makes it fun and engaging? And I have no idea what to say. Well, combat's good when it's very challenging and everyone almost dies, but they don't and they pull through. But that's not like fun, right? Like to have one player with the weight of the world on their shoulders and like 4 others who have not had a combat in 3 turns because they all got down doesn't make a combat good. Well, combat's good when it has narrative weight and is good for the story. I mean, yeah, I guess. But does that make a combat fun? Like, does every single combat need narrative weight? Because I've had plenty of D&D combats that had no narrative weight at all, and they were great and engaging. So what makes good combat? What makes combat fun and engaging? Well, there is that chat answer that's like, it's not that deep, and I want to kill bad guys and watch my elf ranger do cool stuff. And we're probably going to come to the conclusion that that is the right answer. But there's levels to this, right? This is usually the part of the video where I say, look at your favorite video game and how it handles combat encounters, and then just learn from there. But those fundamentals don't really work in this situation. Video games and D&D don't really handle combat the exact same way. Video games are built around these systems that constantly reinforce player growth, while D&D is built around a framework that is flexible enough to accommodate any kind of playstyle. Does that make sense? I'll clarify in a second. As for storytelling, if you want to learn narrative structure or character development, you can study those almost one-to-one with other forms of media. You can watch a movie, you can read a book, you can play a game, and take those lessons and apply them directly into your D&D campaign. But combat is different. Combat doesn't follow that same logic, and I think there's 3 main reasons why. 1, your combat has to accommodate the D&D rules. 2, progression looks completely different. 3. There is no respawning. Let's say you have an intuitive sense on combat design because you have sunk in thousands of hours across a wide variety of different games. You're not going to instinctively understand D&D combat better like you would the 3-act structure watching thousands of films. And unless you're an XCOM player, I find a lot of new DMs being like, well, what if they fought a mummy right now? Or like, what if they fought a displacer beast right now? Part of that is because you don't have the same control a video game designer does. In video games, you tailor your gameplay to the experience, but in D&D, you tailor your game to D&D's gameplay. To D&D's gameplay. Was that smart? Does that sound good? And this reveals 2 significant points of contention within D&D's game design philosophy. Firstly, the official rules have to be broad enough to accommodate any kind of gameplay style from any kind of campaign. And secondly, your game is constrained by what is possible within those rules. And because of that, the typical motivators and principles that drive traditional game design just don't really work here. And yes, I know homebrew exists. You can change the rules of D&D, but how would I even begin to argue for that? Like, it's so arbitrary on what you want to change about the rules to fit your campaign. Like, what do you want me to say? Okay, to clarify what I was saying earlier, the disconnect between traditional game design and D&D's game design happens because a campaign is a dynamic element that changes with the story beats. At the same time, the game's own mechanics are progressing independently, whether or not those upgrades impact the narrative you have made. For example, a monk at 10th level becomes immune to disease and poison, which is great if you're running a grounded campaign where diseases are a common threat. But if you're running this grand scale campaign about interplanar warfare, this ability may never come into play. This isn't inherently a problem with Dungeons & Dragons combat, it just kind of pushes some workload from the designer to the DM, and there are plenty of D&D likes out there that offer a more concise level of gameplay, allowing you to fine-tune your combat to fit your campaign's tone better at the cost of a variety of gameplay styles, if that makes sense. And if you want to stick with 5e combat, it might explain the kind of disconnect that you see between typical game design and also D&D's game design. But that disconnect happens over the course of the campaign. In the short term, traditional gameplay is designed to give the player a feeling of progression. Let's take Legend of Zelda, for example, right? You fight through a dungeon, you get a new item, and now you can face new challenges and bosses that you couldn't before. In Chrono Trigger, you can... Is that too niche? Is that like, is that too niche and aged? Am I like aging myself by saying that? Because like in Legend of Zelda, it's like stayed in the zeitgeist of things. There's new games, there's a movie that comes out, but like for Chrono Trigger, like people, like it's a great game. But I feel like the real ones know what Chrono Trigger is. Which I don't, because I wasn't born yet. I was born 3 years after the game's release in 1995, so. In Steal a Brain Rot, you have to engage in combat, stealing someone else's brain rot, and add it to your collection, giving you a sense of progress. That was good. That was good. In video game design, these short-term feedback loops are used to keep players engaged and to reward them for learning something in the moment. Dungeons & Dragons, however, isn't built for that kind of immediate reinforcement. Instead, players gain more satisfaction from long-form narrative progression, where growth and accomplishment unfold over a story instead of one or even a handful of encounters. After initiative is rolled, combat remains fairly static. There's not much change in tempo or evolving conditions that allows for the players to feel like they're mastering a fight. That is unless a DM adds new elements, such as creature weaknesses or environmental factors, that make it so that the player feels like they're learning something and gaining mastery over their opponents. However, progress isn't always measured by short-term feedback loops or long-term campaign disjointment. In Dark Souls, you can still make your own build, make your own class, but the progression system in that game is based off of your skill growing as a player. This works because you can die and respawn as many times as you'd like, giving you endless chances to learn. D&D, on the other hand, can't be D&D without the stakes of death, so you can't design your combats in the same way based on the same respawning system. In video games, dying allows you to study enemy behavior, adjust your tactics, and improve your skills. In D&D, when you die, you're out of the arena completely, and when you're allowed to come come back, you usually don't pick a new character that better fits the situation, especially if that's in a one-off fight. This means players will rarely refine their skill set through repeated enemy exposure, and instead, it seems like they'll always choose the more narratively satisfying option for their character. So in a sense, you have to design every single combat where the characters won't die, which creates this weird tension because the players themselves can't adjust their skill set in fear of dying, but they know that you as the DM haven't balanced the fight so that they will intentionally die, so they'll take greater risks. And all of this creates this insane balance where in regular video games, the safety nets are like checkpoints and tutorials and respawning, and in a game of D&D, it is purely a social contract that the DM will not kill the players and the players will still have the gumption, the gumption to go and explore the world. And I do want to say as like a side note that I have many times before said, never plan your encounters to be capable of a TPK. And if the dice roll bad that way, it happens, it comes with the game, and it sucks. I hate TPKs. But at the same time, I want to say that you're supposed to balance your encounters in a way that doesn't kill your whole party. Well, who knows, maybe it'll kill one or two. Okay, maybe not two, but maybe one. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Is this advice? What am I doing? Let's say you designed a creature that is invulnerable to all damage at all times unless they're grappled, right? And I'm not saying that's a good monster design, right? I'm saying that for the sake of this example. You have to now try to explain to your players that cannot respond, so they have a shorter amount of time because they have to figure out in the middle of a fight how they can fight this creature that is now invulnerable. And you're not only fighting against the factor that there is kind of a running clock before your players get frustrated that they can't figure it out or die and they think it's unfair and they never show up to your table again, but also because you're trying to paint the picture in a way that is subtle enough for them to figure out that they have to grapple this creature while also dealing with the fact that they don't have an imagination without grabbing them by the shoulders and be like, this is how the fight works. And these combat puzzles are so infuriating to run because you're trying to tell your friends how to change oil on a spaceship. Like they have no idea what's going on. And I've seen some DMs try to replace the punishment of like your character dying with the stun mechanic, and I can't express into words how much I hate that exact kind of thinking. Not only is stun awful because it makes your players unable to participate in the game, there's no feedback from getting stunned. You don't learn people's attack patterns or know more about the environment, and if there is any kind of feedback, it's that don't get stunned again, because then you're not playing the game. I mean, I am being put in a timeout in the middle of a D&D game. Bro, I'm 45 being put into a timeout. And if we just look at the idea of what stun is as a mechanic, what is fun about that? What about adding something that is literally polar opposite of engaging in combat makes it think that we should add stun? Like, stun couldn't be farther from what you want to put into a combat. Because if you're looking for some kind of like short-term feedback loop to teach your players, the way to do that is not put them into timeout for 45 minutes. Maybe that's not the way we should balance our combat, because guess what? Not playing the game is not fun. That's a double negative. That gets confusing. That was beside the point, okay? What I really want to say is that in Dungeons & Dragons, you are leading a team of people, and each one of those players have a character with unique abilities and skills that do a wide variety of things that are good in certain situations and bad in others. And sure, you can go around to each player's character sheet and see what they do and don't excel at and what they're going to level up into, so you can better optimize your game so that each player individually fits better into the narrative. But who has the time for that? I mean, seriously, time has to be the most impactful element of developing good Dungeons & Dragons combat. I could look at each one of your guys' stat block and take advantage of the most niche and newest abilities that you guys have to offer, but I just don't have time to do that. I could look for new monsters that would seem really hard at the beginning, but as you level up halfway through, are really easy at the end. But I just don't have time to do that. And every time it always devolves into me just being like, well, you do more damage, they die quicker. Time is the most impactful part of making good D&D combat, but it's also the most limiting factor of the entire process. Zach, you're telling me in this video, after I've worked 14 hours installing shingles in 100-degree weather, that I'm supposed to come home and work on a combat for my players that barely show up to sessions at all and worry about long-term campaign progression, short-term feedback loops, whatever that means, on top of finding new creatures to keep combat fresh and exciting, as well as finding new abilities for said creatures to also be interesting inside of long-term dungeons? How does that make sense? And then my players will do something dumb, and I'm supposed to have the available bandwidth to be like, well, how can I integrate new mechanics into this fight that would allow my players to feel like they're learning and making progress while also simultaneously utilizing the abilities and no one expects the DM to replicate the efficiency that video game software has to enable satisfying feedback loops in my home D&D game. But I think it's essential to understanding why sometimes short-term one-off fights don't feel satisfying. So how do we fix this? Guys, come on. Guys, can we please just stay in the realm of the analytical and philosophical? Like, do I have to provide answers to the questions I make? I just want to talk about why they're there. What I've seen that helps me the most is kind of sticking to the Dimension 20 route of how combat works, where it's like one session, it's all narrative, and another session, it's all combat. And of course, your players are going to do things to engage in combat outside of the combat session, right? And that's to be expected, and that's fine. Don't pressure yourself about making good, out-of-nowhere improvised combat, even though that's kind of what 90% of the game was made in the first place. Allowing for a full session to be just combat gives you the same amount of time you would have to regularly prep a session, but now you can spend that entire time looking at how the combat how that combat encounter will evolve. This will give you more time to figure out what exactly is the edge of this combat that'll make it so that it's more satisfying, it's more memorable, so that you can utilize underutilized abilities that some of your players might have, and just to make it more fun. I've also been experimenting with my own short-term feedback loops outside of the progression of character levels and abilities, or even items that they may already have. For example, I made a dungeon where there are certain creatures that had different colored auras around them. So like I had lizard people with a green aura, and then some kind of goblins with like a red aura, and these aura colors correlated with gems scattered throughout the dungeon. So when the players first entered the dungeon, they would face normal creatures, but also creatures with these auras, and the ones with the auras were invulnerable to all kinds of damage. So as they explored the dungeon, they found these crystals, destroyed them, and as their progress continued, the dungeon got easier until they utilized that final system in the boss of the dungeon. I also made another dungeon. It was more like an area of the game, not a dungeon, where the boss was originally introduced in the first room, but it was impervious to all damage. Do you see like this kind of repeating trope I do? And as they went around the dungeon, they found more and more weaknesses. There were like these vials of its soul's essence that ended up breaking it, that later made it so that the boss could be fought. And I can share countless examples of both things I've done in the past and things I've seen other people do to make it so that combat is more fun and engaging. But I think the core principles stay the same. D&D's progression system focuses more on the individual, funny enough, in the collaborative storytelling game, that is separated from the narrative itself. So you as the DM have to figure out ways how to make the short-term combat more satisfying. So, what makes good Dungeons & Dragons combat? I think it starts with understanding where the problems stem from. D&D struggles to find a good progression system in their short-term fights. At the same time, their long-term campaign progression is so disconnected from the narrative you're trying to tell. Stale encounters will always exist, but the memorable ones, the ones you hear your players talk about for months after, they bridge that gap. And once you realize how to form encounters around that connection, you won't be just running better combat. You'll be making fights players will remember. Thanks for watching.